In today's lesson, we continue our journey into the sinister world of cybercrime. We're going to be looking more closely at the threat landscape, or threat environment as it's often called. Before we dive into this lesson, let's quickly revisit the lesson challenge from the last lesson. You may recall that you were asked to use the indicators of compromise list provided in the lesson to search the SHA-256 hash function on the website provided. All you needed to complete this task was covered in the demo on extracting an executable from a PCAP on Wireshark. Remember, you're always able to go back and rewatch the previous lessons. In today's lesson, we're going to explore pervasive ransomware threats. We're going to view RaaS operations to illustrate the damage done by ransomware in 2019. And we're going to introduce some common trends, activities, tactics, techniques, and procedures in cybercrime, and watch a demo where we show you how to work with network mapping. According to a threat report issued by the American cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike, in 2019, RaaS demand soared into millions of dollars, causing unparalleled disruption. Let's start today's lesson by examining this concerning trend a bit closer. CrowdStrike also found that there's been a significant rise in what is known as big game hunting. This is when cybercriminals focus on stealing high-value data and assets belonging to large businesses to secure a high ransom. They do this because they know that big businesses are particularly sensitive to downtown and therefore more likely to pay big money. There are numerous ransomware groups or operations such as Wizard, Spider, Indirect Spider, and Double Spider crawling around the web causing millions of attacks. An interesting fact about Pinchy Spider. Did you know that Pinchy Spider is the criminal group behind the development of the ransomware most commonly known as GandCrab, which has been active since January 2018. Pinchy Spider sells access to use GandCrab ransomware under a partnership program with a limited number of accounts. The program is generally operated with a 60-40 split in profits, 60% going to the customer and 40% to them, as is common among e-crime actors. These days, everyone can be the target for a ransomware attack if they have attractive data and essential data. But there are some institutions and organizations that are particularly vulnerable to attacks for various reasons. Here is a table representing ransomware targets in the US during November and December 2019. Note the industries that were targeted and the choice of malware to disrupt day-to-day operations. In the last few years, educational institutions like colleges and universities have been the top ransomware targets, mainly because they have less sophisticated IT teams and systems and a high rate of file sharing. Healthcare firms are also vulnerable to ransomware attacks because they are always pretty keen to pay the ransom quickly as they need access to their patients' data. These are people in a critical stage of life. According to CrowdStrike Intelligence, cybercrime threats mostly come in the following forms. Banking Trojans. These are techniques used to steal info in the banking sector. Spam bots. Programs designed to collect or harvest email addresses from the internet. Business email compromise scams. These are more commonly known as phishing scams. Big game hunting threat groups. These are highly sophisticated targeted e-crime operations, as already mentioned. Carding shops that conduct credit card fraud. And Ransomware-as-a-Service operations. Ransomware developed by hackers and sold to other users for cash. Here is a table of just a handful of the more common techniques used by threat actors. They are terminating a security product to avoid detection, using DSN protocol for tunneling and hiding data, hosting malware on a compromised website and attracting people with adverts, and infiltrating email conversations to get information. Port scanning is usually part of a reconnaissance attack. There are a variety of port scanning methods that can be used. We have a demo to show you how to use the Nmap utility. Nmap is a powerful network utility that is used for network discovery and security auditing. Let's dive right into our demo. Okay, for this demo, we're going to be talking about Nmap. So basically, it's a network exploring tool that helps network engineers or security personnel to be able to scan ports and to be able to conduct a lot of vulnerability checks on a network. So what it means is with the use of Nmap, you would be able to scan the network. You could actually see if the network has a host attached on the network. You could also see if the host is up. Now, what I mean by up is if the host is actually online or offline. And with the other features, you would be able to scan to see the kind of operating system the target IP address has. And you can actually identify the ports running on the IP address. So basically, with the use of Nmap, you could actually map the whole network. So this is a very useful network tool for conducting reconnaissance. But a note to students as well. There are a lot of laws around mapping of networks. So what that means is there are some laws, depending on the country you're residing in, that actually restrict you from mapping out a network. So that means when you're watching this video, do not try to map someone's network, because if you get caught doing that, you could face jail time. So basically, it's only advisable to map the network when you have the authorized or administrative rights to do so on the network. So before you map a network, you should have the authority from the network owner saying it's fine. Without that, I would strongly advise you not to map anyone's network. So, I'm going to show you a few steps on how you can go about mapping networks. And for this, first up, we would be using our virtual machines in our VirtualBox. And I have my CyberOps workstation running. You can simply just jump back into our terminal. And while on your terminal, we can run some commands like we did in the previous lessons. And the first command is basically to read through it so that you kind of have a better understanding of Nmap as a network tool. So type the command Nmap. At the moment, you can see a lot of text being generated on the terminal. You have a description in here with more details. So Nmap is just a network tool used for exploring and auditing a network. Now, what that means basically is you put in a command to scan a web page. Let's learn with the example from the man nmap command. Now, the reason you have this example, see scanme.nmap.org, this means they're telling you to use this website as a test for this example. So, for this example, we're going to be running the first test. So then we would look at more networks that we have the ability to scan. And after that, we would exploit this network to see the type of information we get after the scan. So that leaves the question, what are the commands being used while scanning a network? So when we use Nmap, there are lots of different commands to use. So basically, for an offense in advanced cybersecurity personnel, they would be scanning a network for vulnerabilities. So because they know more about the network weakness, they know what to actually look for on the network. As a beginner, I would be walking you through the common things you'll be looking for when you scan a network. So first of all, you want to know the operating system of the network. So if you see this from the example, we have nmap-a-t4 scanme.nmap.org. What this means is the name Nmap just shows the network tool we're actually utilizing. And -a shows us to detect the operating system of the targeted machine we are scanning. So you would be able to get the version of the operating system, and also you will be able to get the trace route of the IP. So what that means is the path it takes for your packet to travel to its destination. Trace route highlights the hops from sender to destination. So imagine if a car needs to drive from the UK to somewhere in Australia. They would have to go through different junctions that connect its road to get to Australia. So that's exactly the same scenario here. A packet has to travel through different routes and different switches before getting from their source to their destination. So now we actually have all this text we've read. And if we understand what it means, we can simply try it out. So basically, we go back again and press Q to exit the main page. And we can use the command clear to remove any evidence of things on the screen. And we can simply start using the nmap command. So first of all, we can start with mapping the nmap web page by typing the command nmap-a-t4. And just a note for students, when we use the -4, this basically determines the speed at which nmap will execute the command. So if we want this to be really fast, we can decrement this 4 to 0. So that means it'll go very quickly. But we just want to do the mapping in a regular time so it doesn't take too long or too short. It gives you the required time to actually map the network. So we use T4 because it's like a recommended time that is used on the nmap. So now we can put in the web page, or if we have the IP address of the web page, you can use that if you'd like. But in this case, we'll start first with the web page address. So we're going to type the web page, which is scanme.nmap.org. Just a note for students, before you get to this point, make sure you do check your settings on your VirtualBox. Now to do this, you have to go to Device on a tab. You have to go to Network and go to your network settings. Now the reason for this is because for the majority of the time, the setting in the VirtualBox often reverts back to the default each time you close your VirtualBox. So make sure you do set your VirtualBox to use the NAT, or you use the command ./lab.support.files/configures_as_dhcp.sh, like in our previous demo. If you remember in the lesson, we said that NAT actually helps to convert public addresses to private addresses and vice versa. So basically, for us to be able to scan this web page, or if you actually are unsure that this is a web page, you can navigate to a web browser and type in exactly the same URL. And I'm just going to copy this, exactly the same URL, so we can verify that this is a real URL. So you can see at the moment this is a live URL. When using nmap, we will be able to know what kind of operating system is hosting this web server on the internet. So when we go back again to the terminal, we can simply click on Enter, and we will let the nmap process start. Another note to students, when you use the nmap tool and you scan for a port number, an IP address, or even a URL, you should also remember the computer or network you are actually scanning will know that someone is scanning their system. So what that means is nmap basically works with ICMP ping echo requests. That is the initial stage of the Nmap knowing if the host is actually up. The moment you issue any commands, you might not see each other's details in your book, but be sure to know that the map actually pings that person. So if that person was to check their system, they would be able to verify someone scanning the network. We can now see the map result is back, and we can go through the whole result. So now I know this is the URL I visited, and now we can actually see the IP address. So if you remember from the last demo, we said that DNS helps to resolve IP addresses into name servers for humans to be able to read, and vice versa. So basically, this IP address is the same location of this URL. So each time you go into your browser and you type in the same URL, you are literally entering this IP address. So to test this out, we're simply going to run the same command again and put in the URL. We're going to put in the IP address and see and verify if we're able to scan the same network. So type nmap-a-t4 45.33.32.156. You can actually see the usefulness of the map. While we wait for the second scan, we can talk about the first scan. So if you look at this scan, we can see a few things. We're able to know the IP address hosting the web page. Now from the scan, we're able to see these results. Okay, at the moment, we just go back to the second scan result, and we can see we got exactly the same details as the first time, because we're scanning the same server. So we'll just go with this one as well. We can see from the scan we have 996 filtered ports. Now what this means is the port says filtered, but this doesn't mean there are no processes running behind those ports. It just means Nmap could not identify the process on the port. So in other words, Nmap would just regard those ports as being filtered. So what that means is that Nmap is unable to actually access those ports to verify to see what kind of process was run on the ports. This means that the 996 filter ports are ports that Nmap could not verify to see what was running behind it. But we're able to see some other ports. So I'm actually going to maximize the screen really quick. So now we are able to see some of our ports. Now, when we look at the port service, we have the port 22. And that is our SSH. And we were able to see this is the SSH running on the server, and we could actually see the hotkeys from the web server. So if we actually look further, you can see we have a port 80, which is our HTTP, that is Hypertext Transfer Protocol, running on the web server to verify that we can jump back into the web server and see what kind of protocols were being used on that web server. We can clearly see this host uses an HTTP. So if you do look, if you remember from our previous demos, when we assessed the web server, you can see there was a form of a padlock. You know, at this point, it's missing, and you just have this esoteric, which means it's unsecured. So indirectly, we're actually assessing an HTTP web server, which means the page is actually not secured. But for the purpose of this demo, we're not actually entering any key details on the web. So we're just scanning the website. So we should be fine because we're not actually typing in any of our personal details into the web server. Okay, so back again to the result. So if we look at the result, we can actually see the host is up, which means the host is online. And you can see some of the ports that are open and on the web you can see there is a web server being hosted. It's running on an Ubuntu. And the second one just has a title, Go Ahead and Scan Me, which means the owner of the web server actually authorizes you to scan his web page. So these are the only ways you would be able to actually scan someone's network. In other words, you're not allowed to scan networks which are the authority of the administrator of the network. So we're able to see from our scan that we have the TCP ports open. And at the end of the scan, we're able to actually get the operating system off the web server, hosting the web page. So from the scan results, we know that the web page is hosted on a Linux server. So we know that we can see the time it took us to actually scan the web server. We know that we can see the amount of information we can derive from just simply scanning an IP on a network. So for a beginner, these details might look not really useful, but for someone who has a lot of knowledge on scanning ports and scanning network and MUPs, they will be able to dig deeper into the network and actually exploit the network if they really need to. So I'm actually going to walk you through some different examples. But before I do that, I'm going to show you how to scan specific ports. So basically, from the example we were able to see we have quite a few ports running. So we had a port 22 for the SSH. And we had a port 80 for our HTTP. Let's actually scan to show you how to scan only the ports. So that means that the next command that I'm actually going to put in there will be scanning just specific ports on the targeted machine. So we simply type the word nmap-s T-P. I'm just going to pause here to explain the command. We have the -st, which actually stands for TCP port scanning. So we're just scanning the TCP ports. So if you look at these results we have from the previous scan, you can actually see there is a 22/TCP. So this is actually what we're scanning for. We're scanning for this port. So we use the -st space -p. And now the -p basically stands for ports. So we are instructing the command to say we want to scan for TCP ports. And these are the exact specific ports we want to scan for. So at this moment, we know port 80 is open. So we can scan for port 80. We know from our previous result that port 443 is closed. But for the sake of testing, we're just going to put it in and we'll see what actually happens with our result. So the next thing we do, we put in our IP address. So if you remember, this is actually the IP of the web server where the website has been hosted on. And we put in that IP. So that is 45.33.32.156. Now let's clear up the screen to set up a new fresh page and type the full command nmap-st-p 80,22,45.33.32.156. So you can see there it said failed to resolve. And this was done initially just to see the results of the scan. So you can see at the moment, you have the host up, and you can see rather than having the whole bunch of results, we just have the results showing the ports are actually running on the IP address. So you can see at the moment, we have this port running. And if you look more closely, you'll see I have left the port 443. Now, this was done intentionally just to show you the difference between filtered and closed. So if you remember from the previous scan, we actually did have a 443. Now, this was introduced just simply to show you what happened. When you put in a port that is not present on the scan, it wouldn't throw the scan off balance. The scan will still work, but just show the ports and their status. So in this case, it means that ports cannot be accessed. I'm actually going to show you some commands that we can do with the Nmap. And this time around, we're actually going to be scanning ourselves. So how do we go about doing that? So if you remember from our last lessons, we spoke about the lookback address. And we said the lookback address is actually on our lookback interface. And that is used for management purposes. So at the moment, we have our lookback, and it comes with defaults on every network device. So we're going to scan ourselves to see the ports running on our network. But how do we do that? So simply, we're just going to still use the nmap command. So we put in nmap-a-t4 localhost dot. So now what happens is rather than actually scanning an IP address, we're scanning ourselves, our computer. But if you remember, the IP address for localhost is 127.0.0.1. So now we have a result back here. If we do want to test to see if our localhost is the same as our IP address we have for our localhost, we can actually test it out by a person. Okay, we get our localhost, and we just use backspace and type in the IP address 127.0.0.1. And so now this should give us exactly the same information we got when we actually typed in our local host. So we're just going to wait for the results. At the moment, we have a result and we can actually see this is a scan of ourselves. So we are going through it. We can actually see our host is up, which has to be up because we are scanning ourselves. So on this virtual machine, we have about 998 closed ports. Now, just to note, the previous scan we actually had was a filtered port. Now, this time around, we have a closed port. So you can see there's no difference between closed ports and filtered ports. Closed port simply means the Nmap scan could not access that port at all. So it means that port is closed and it's locked. So when we scanned the web server, we actually saw we had 2 filtered ports, which means the Nmap was able to identify that there is a port running there, but couldn't see the service name of those ports. So the first port we have is port 21. Now, port 21 is the FTP, which stands for File Transfer Protocol. In our earlier lessons, we actually covered the FTP. So we have the port 22 open, which is our SSH, and we can actually see the SSH hotkeys from our server. So at the moment, the last bit just shows us we have one IP and one host is up. And it shows us the time it takes to actually scan the local host. So that wraps up this demo on Nmap. In the next lab demo, I will be walking through this process, the differences between Telnet and SSH traffic on Wireshark. That way students can get familiar with them. On the demo, we will be actually going through the practical aspects and be exploiting traffic from a web server. From the demo, we're able to see why SSH is preferred in an enterprise network. Upon completing this lesson, your assignment will be made available. This is an optional exercise for you to test your knowledge on the material so far.